I'm wondering why you folks picked this particular workshop. You know, it's really, I've got an idea, whenever anybody gets up to speak, you've got some sense of who you're talking to. And so, you know, obviously I'm aware of what's been going on at the conference, and you know, I feel like I'm surrounded by, I do come in by a lot of fellow spirits. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. And it's hard to know what language to use, what references are familiar to you, unless I can get some sort of feedback. So I'm a professional teacher. I teach at an indigenous-oriented university. It's a modern university, but we've got a very strong Native Hawaiian component. It's a sort of situation where you get a really big mix of students. You've got obviously Native Hawaiian, you've got an indigenous component, which is the largest of all the campuses in Hawaii. But there's also a large military population. Hawaii is one of the biggest military bases in the United States, of mainland United States. Do you guys want to bring some chairs from some of the other rooms?
I'm standing actually.
Really? Yeah, okay. We want to get comfortable. We've also got a large Asian population, Japanese, Hawaiian, Japanese American, immigrant population, Filipino. So there's a terrific diversity of ethnic groups and socioeconomic groups in the classes. And the stuff that we're dealing with, I run a small political science program, but I'm a political philosopher. And so the issues that we deal with are issues of deep meaning. And you know, what is real, what is important. They're really issues philosophically of epistemology. How do we know what is true, what is real? And so you've got to be able to manage a great variety of opinions in discussion, and my teaching is discussion based. So I start off by telling a bit of my story, so students know where I'm coming from and what I have to share and what my background of experience is, because ultimately everything that we know comes from our own experience. Whatever science we learn, whatever philosophy we learn, whatever ideas we have about reality and the planet and the future, we mill it through our own life story. So your life story really is the frame of everything that you know. But it's excluded explicitly in science and academia because the method of science has become the dominant mode of knowing reality. And by definition, it's objective. It doesn't deal with the subjective structure of your emotions and your whole life view. So I start off with my story and also get some sort of sense of who's in the class and where they're coming from. So I don't know if anybody would like to just kick off saying a few things about why they chose this. What do you think you are?
So cosmology was the key word for me.
Yeah.
Because I get weary and tired of like issues, events. Like I need a context for all of those to be in, for me to be able to have a larger sense of meaning, and for me to not get so pissed off.
Way to go.
So
Love it. Yeah, it's exactly what a cosmology provides. A cosmology is a big picture, story of origin, where we come from, where we are, and where we should go. And it's the ultimate frame of meaning. It's a reality map. And whatever we do, we're doing it in reference to a cosmology, even if we're unconscious of it. So what I try and do, this is actually a model of what I try and do in my classroom, is bring students up to speed in thinking about cosmologies, thinking about worldviews, how they're constructed, and how we know they're true. Because obviously, we're living in a country, we're living in a world where people have radically different worldviews and are prepared to go to war over them and kill one another and blow one another up. So the crucial political issue to me, I mean, clearly on environmental issues, you know, we have a big section of the population that denies that there's a problem with global warming and that we're entering the sixth mass extinction on Earth, and we have another section of the population that is extremely fired up about that reality. If we can come to some sort of general agreement, the problems are not problems of technology, the problems are problems of consciousness. Yeah.
And so I'm here because I have a strategy for how to develop that unifying view, perspective, global perspective, and actually in my sessions here have been a kind of experiment in presenting that.
Oh, excellent.
So that's where my
Excellent,
interest is.
excellent. So our interests converge because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. What I've called the method that I've developed is the truth quest, but it's not really my method. It's identifying 4 dimensions of the wisdom tradition, which are universal, perennial, and which seem to emerge with the beginning of human consciousness. So in telling that story of the awakening of human consciousness and what these elements are, and then diving deep and analyzing them, reflecting deeply on them, and examining how they play out in practice in the history of humanity from our earliest beginnings on the coast of southern Africa. Sorry?
Could you name those four again?
I will. The whole show is about that. So I'll go through, the slideshow and give them to you. So I just want to have some sense of how much, because I've got a lot of big ideas. Their interaction, their synergy is complex, but it's also intuitive. It's something that I think everybody's familiar with, and often people who've never been to school, who don't have an education, are more attuned to the practice. They do it automatically. These are things we do automatically. But by bringing them to consciousness, and by clarifying them, if you like, philosophically, linguistically, we can reproduce them, teach them, integrate them into the curriculum, and do a repair job wherever we are. Whenever we're dealing with other human beings, we embodying these four dimensions.
Yeah. Besides politics, what is the basis? What is the basic difference, in your opinion, between animal consciousness and human consciousness?
I think the big takeoff, again, I'm going to deal with this in the slideshow, the big takeoff is the loop of self-reflection. When consciousness loops back on itself with the birth of modern human Homo sapiens sapiens, human beings that know that they know. That is the big takeoff point. Tao de Chardin called it the noosphere. You folks familiar with that? You guys heard of Tao de Chardin?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, fantastic. Way to go. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
You have the most important picture up there, and it's almost become sort of blasé in our culture to see the Earth floating in space, but it wasn't always like that.
It wasn't always like that in what sense?
And to see the Earth floating in space is as much of a transformation as the invention of agriculture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've kind of
Yeah.
lost
Right.
our sense of how amazing that really is.
Right.
And for me, it's quite personal because I've been pushing this for decades and only learned a few years ago that the president who initiated the space program to do that said, let's go to the moon with the Russians as a joint effort. Has anyone ever heard that?
No.
Where would the world
Makes
be?
sense. Makes perfect
Where would the
sense.
world be if the Cold War had
Right.
ended in 1964?
Right, right. Where if the motivation was coming together as a species on
Yeah.
a single planet.
And one fun fact is the picture doesn't show it, but the atmosphere that is breathable is so thin. You go up in a plane at 35,000 feet, you can't breathe there. That's
Right.
7 miles. What's 7 miles in any
Right.
direction from here?
Right. We can basically walk to where we can't breathe the air.
Yeah.
By memories.
And then we fall down dead because we
Yeah.
can't breathe
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
So if we had
Yeah.
that consciousness that we're all on spaceship Earth together,
Right.
most of these things would evaporate.
Right, right, and that's exactly what a modern cosmology, the emerging cosmology, offers. It offers an Earth story and it offers a universe story that places us, the thinking, conscious human being, and the whole history of human civilization within this extraordinary reality. And the more you contemplate it, it's a matter of reflection. It is a meditation, it is a discipline that is expurgated from our educational system. So the idea is to bring it back wherever we can. So, clearly this is a venue where you do it intuitively because you're in nature, and there's that powerful resonance between the human body and consciousness and the natural world and plants and animals. But we spend most of our lives indoors in human-constructed spaces with human-constructed objects, getting this reinforcement that reality is really human-constructed. It's a world of artifacts, consumer objects. And what I'm interested in doing, and what I've been doing most of my professional life, is to work within these structures as a professor at a university, but also in the beaches and up in the mountains in Hawaii and the bush in South Africa, where I come from, trying to integrate this. So doing what you can with what you have where you are. Maybe just take one or two more, and then I'll start showing you some pictures, if that's okay. Yeah.
I chose this because I really think that our being conscious is the tool, the underlying thing that we need in order to affect any change. And so I just want some more tools.
Way to go. Way to go. Fantastic. Yeah. Anybody else? Want to just offer anything at this point? It's really helpful to have these reference points, you know, so people are familiar with the work of Teilhard, some of you. Sorry, yeah.
I came here because of the workshops that I've been going to have been how to fix things, and I would really want a bigger picture.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
One last one?
Sure.
So you're assuming that human and animal consciousness is, there's a sharp divide between them, or there's a...
No, I think it's a continuity. I think it's a matter of degree.
It's a matter of
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah, in fact, you know, again, I'll get into this, but I think it's good to have some repetition and to start with a bit of feedback with where you guys are at. But I think I understand consciousness as being intrinsic to matter. It's a facet of matter. And our culture is very confused about the relationship between consciousness and reality, because the founding assumption, and it is an assumption, and it was a kind of crazy assumption from the inset in the 17th century, essentially René Descartes' dualism, separating consciousness from the body and from the world and just focusing on what you could mathematize, the beginning of the scientific method. But really consciousness is intrinsic to existence. It's as if the consciousness we have in our brain is an inner version of the entire universe out there. So, you know, potentially we have access to everything in its inner aspect through all sorts of technologies. Shamanic technology is the most obvious, all indigenous cultures practice these. But what I want to add to this mix is the practice of disciplined history, philosophy, and science. And I think what we need is that sort of synthesis, a sacred science, a science of worship. Yeah.
I came in late, but I was wondering, are you going to address this concept of the physics of consciousness, which I'm told is going to really change things once we get into that? It's a new field, the physics of consciousness. Have you heard that?
I'm not going to get into it in nitty-gritty detail. I'm trying to work with the stuff that is most accessible, most critically needed, with the bigger pictures. The four elements of the truth quest, since one of you folks, gentlemen, asked, the first one's individuation, the integration of your own life story and your own consciousness through reflection and through living as copiously as you can. The second one is face-to-face discussion, the Socratic method. And that gets you out of your bubble. It makes you realize that however smart you are, however much acclaim you've got, however many books you've written, they're all coming within your life trajectory and framed by your experience. So you can always learn something from everyone you meet. So discussion is really the essence of a method of expanding your worldview. And that, of course, was the royal road of philosophy for Socrates, who actually criticized lectures, what I'm doing now, and libraries and books, because they tended to freeze the process of truth questing. The third one is community. None of this exists without a supporting community and without community involvement, because our intelligence, our consciousness itself, is a product of society. It emerges out of the complex social life of primates. And you know, what you have is the individual emerging individuation, intention of the community throughout evolution. As the species, as we get more and more complex species throughout the 4.6 billion years of Earth's history, so the individual has a greater capacity to separate him or herself from the community, but also bond more intensely with the community. So you've got to have that community dimension in your truth seeking. You have to pay attention to the community, which means making the classroom a community. However short your period is, your class is, whether it's a semester or whether it's just one gathering for an hour and a half, like this afternoon, as much as possible, we're trying to come together, create relationships or sparks of relationships between a bunch of people, which will hopefully enlarge our shared vision of what our problems are and how we go forward. The fourth and final element, well, semi-final element, is the big picture, cosmology, what you asked for. A frame, a narrative of origin, where we are and where we should go, that binds everything together. Now, the point of these four is that they're open-ended. There's no end. Your big picture can always be bigger, can always include more experience. We don't know what was there at the beginning, before the Big Bang. The Big Bang is sort of the limiting case of credulity. If you believe in the Big Bang, you'll believe in anything. That everything exploded out of nothing, right? 14 billion years ago. Yet it's true. as true as any of the rest of our science is true. So we're sort of compelled to face this primordial mystery at the foundation of existence. And of course, where we're going is an even bigger mystery. I mean, we have an idea that the sun will blow up and become a red giant in about 5 billion years. What does this whole thing mean? We are so overwrought by our predicament within these two great mysteries. And my suggestion is, of course, that we need to relate to these two mysteries as Einstein encouraged us to do, and recognize that mystery is the most beautiful thing you can experience. It's the origin of all true science and art. And I would add to that, it should be the origin of all true politics. And I think you have a model of that in a lot of indigenous cultures, where this relationship to the Great Spirit, the Great Spirit is called the Great Mystery. Wakantanka, the Great Holy, or the Great Mystery. And it's that relationship that is paramount in tuning human consciousness. So all those four elements need to be tuned by that experience of nature as the closest face of that great mystery. Georgia, do you want to?
One more short question.
Yeah.
So we hear a lot of stuff about post-human stuff in the technology types.
Yeah.
Do you think that humanity is is the final species to have consciousness, whether it be an artificial species or we will evolve into a superhuman of some kind focus, or are we in our current sort of physical manifestation anywhere near getting to a termination point of any kind?
Well, that's a really loaded question, which maybe we
Sorry
should
about
save.
that.
No, it's cool. We should save it perhaps or return to it for the end. At this point, let me just say about where we're going is that I think self-reflective consciousness is very new, and I think it confuses the heck out of us. And I think we've lost our way in very obvious ways if you actually pay attention, if you actually look. And that the next step, and the most urgent step to make sure there is a biosphere that's viable, and to try and regenerate and repair as much of the earth as we can, is tune our consciousness. So I don't think we've fully made the leap into Homo sapiens sapiens. I think we're still completing that leap. And that's really the area that I'm most interested in, because I think it's happening. We're doing this. It's evident in this conference that we're surrounded by people who are doing all these four things. But I think it helps to clarify this, philosophically, as an epistemology, as a theory of knowledge, and then develop a pedagogy out of it, which is what I've been trying to do in this small university where I've been teaching. Do you want to jump in at this point, Gia? Or just about the structure of the
further
talk?
on, but,
Yeah.
but a lot of the questions that have come up probably will get addressed, hopefully if we don't run out of time. So these are the same questions that we ponder a lot and discuss a lot. So to your question, I think that the answer is we don't know, but that's what makes it so exciting. And the trajectory of history so far of what has happened is so unbelievable and so exciting. And this moment, I'm not the only one to say this, many people have said it, this is the most exciting time to be alive as we wake up to this. It's also extremely terrifying and horrifying in other ways, but those two together make this, I wouldn't have wanted to be alive at any other time, because I don't know how this is all going to turn out. So, and then I heard someone else say, looking for kind of like a map or something, a tool or something. That's what Louis' model's been for me. So it anchors me as I learn about things like the physics of consciousness and all this different stuff, and I get confused. I use this model because it's a visual model to kind of ground me and file things in the right place so that I can think about it, and then I think about that and think about how humans we can do that and why, and then it just
Cool.
goes on and on. So
Nicely said. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of pictures, and then, if there's something that's really confusing, or if you want to immediately clarify, you can just stop me. Because I like as much as possible to keep it, back and forth as a conversation. but obviously our time's limited, and I've got a story to share here. So this is the basic beginning, that what I think is the ontological starting point of philosophy and cosmology. We wake up in a story that's already underway. You know, the philosopher Martin Heidegger felt that Western philosophy had reached a dead end, and we had to go back to pre-Platonic, pre-Plato beginnings. But I think we've got to go back much further to something that resonates intuitively with every human being. And we all wake up in a situation that we didn't make. You know, I woke up in South Africa as a Jew, neo-Nazi country, under apartheid, a few years after the death camps had been liberated, in a country where nominally I was white, but the black population was suffering horribly. The Jews were very involved in the anti-apartheid movement, so our position was kind of precarious. I was brought up to believe that as a Jew my place was Israel, and I didn't belong to South Africa or Africa, and joined the kibbutz, utopian socialist kibbutz movement. And as soon as I graduated from university, moved to Israel and lived on kibbutz, and joined the military as a gung-ho paratrooper, and was woken up by war and confronting an indigenous Palestinian population and asking myself, what the hell am I doing with my life? Israel in many ways is home for me. It's the home of my tribe, my people. I felt very much at home there, but South Africa is even more the home of my bones and my body. So it was, sorting this out was a huge job for me. It was a work of political cosmology, but I didn't realize that at the time. I had no words for trying to figure this out. Why the Holocaust? What does it mean to be Jewish? Why apartheid? I was brought up in part by Africans, blacks, immersed in black languages, Mawasa, eating the food, listening to the music, in an environment where there was still big chunks of pristine wilderness. There's a herd of wild elephants a half an hour outside the city where I grew up, Port Elizabeth, small city on the coast. I used to explore caves that were occupied by humans 100,000 years ago. I had no idea, in fact no one really knew that this coastline was the site of that last leap that we were talking about in self-reflective consciousness. So I made these incredible discoveries. In fact, I feel blessed and privileged to have had a life which was really a series of revelations. And I reflected back on that and looked around at my situation and kept asking, how was I able to see this, and how can I share this? You don't want to be alone. The prisoner who's liberated from Plato's cave in the Republic returns to the cave and risks death and ridicule in order to liberate his fellows, her fellows. Patriarchal society. So, I felt this compulsion all the time to share what I was learning and make the world a better place. And, what I found was that what I was doing was really primal. It was embedded in the politics of early hunting-gathering societies and embedded in the structures of consciousness. So that's the work. We come out of mystery, we go into mystery. And this applies to every one of us. We can all relate to it. Every one of you has your story of being born into a culture you didn't choose, at a time you didn't choose, to parents you didn't choose, and you've got to try and figure it out for yourself. Ultimately, you realize you're not mommy and you're not daddy. Who are you? And sometimes they maybe do cruel things to you, and they hopefully give you a lot of love and attention. Where do I come from, and how should I live? So what is political cosmology? Technically, this is going to be a bit repetitive, but I think these are big concepts, and it's nice to have a sort of shared lexicon, a shared definition. It's a reality map, story of origins and meaning. It's not a branch of knowledge. It's often treated in academia as a specialty. It's not a specialty. I think that's a deformation of what it is. It's an attempt to integrate all knowledge. It's indispensable, but it's never certain, because it's always open, yeah?
Are you all right with the photographs of slides, or would you rather not?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
But before you publish them or anything like that, can you check with me?
No, I wouldn't publish them, it's from my own use.
Yeah, sure.
Notes, quick notes.
So this is the thesis of the talk. I do not want to sit down, that way you can see the screen. Yeah. We in between cosmologies, and it's a crisis. You can't live without one. Our old cosmology is clearly dysfunctional, but it's still dominant. We're on the path to ecocide underway on all continents. And new stories emerging. a new cosmology is emerging, everything I've said is obviously framed by the new cosmology because I'm aware of it. So you're already getting the new cosmology in my sort of presentation of whatever I've presented so far in my office. I just had to get that in, so it's not just black and white and text.
Corona beer there?
Yeah, exactly. It's not exactly my beach, the one I go to, but I have a beach similar to that, and it's a very important component. It's one of the things I discovered is that in doing this intellectual work, it's really important to have nature immersion, where your mind is going free and you're playing and you can just tune in, and then the earth itself obviously speaks to anybody who knows anything about spending time in the wilderness, as I'm sure everybody does here, aware of indigenous wisdom. Nature is the big medicine, the earth is the big medicine. So the emerging cosmology is grounded in the mystery of evolution. So this is something that we always forget. We get carried away with our cleverness and our constructions because we invest a lot of time and energy, and I'm like everybody else, I've got a lot invested in this construction, but it is nevertheless construction, and it's ongoing, and every person I meet has something to teach me, and this is a part of my ongoing cosmology construction. It includes all past cosmologies as much as we can. Obviously impossible, but we've got to be open to that. That every culture has its own way of orienting itself in the universe. What is dramatic and what is a big revelation for me is that this new story illuminates the truth quest, what I call the truth quest, those 4 elements, as a method of cosmology construction and as a way of living. So it's 2 things. It's both a politics and a method. The method gives the cosmology its truth. There's a circularity here, and it's an inevitable circularity, and we don't like that. It confuses us. But that's because we're in the middle. We don't stand outside reality. We embody reality. And so we're discovering the method as we're discovering the story, and the story is revealing the method, and the method is confirming the truth of the story. And it'll become clearer as we go on. The circularity is life enhancing. Ultimate test of the truth of your cosmology. Is it compatible with the life of Earth? So this is the big story. The truth quest, philosophy, cosmology, all our science, all our knowledge grows out of the evolving Earth. We've lost that connection. Most emphatically since Descartes, but it began with the beginning of civilization. So this is the picture from geology. The Earth as it is now, the spheres of the Earth, this Earth's crust. Bright red is the mantle, the lava that comes up most dramatically in Hawaii. And then the outer core and the inner core, which are incredibly hot, more or less solid. It grows. We don't think of the Earth, we think of the Earth as a place, but we don't think of it like a tree growing. These are the rings, if you like, the growth rings of the Earth. The Earth grows as it cools over 4.6 billion years. It's actually, the growth is the cooling process. The universe burst forth in incredible heat and light 14 billion years ago, and has been cooling ever since, and expanding, and condensing, coming together in stars and galaxies and vast solar systems. And so the Earth, as it cools, it becomes more complex in structure, more layers, more interactions, more relationships, and becomes more conscious. So it starts with the barosphere, which is that molten thing in the middle. As it cools, it forms a crust, like crust and custard. Hydrosphere cools further, water vapor condenses down in rains that last 100 million years, covering the Earth in oceans, so it's the blue layer. Atmosphere is invisible, I've just left it. The biosphere is the green layer. The green layer is the interaction between the atmosphere, between all the elements. So as layers form, so they interact and generate more complexity of structure and form. Biosphere is the living layer, and then we have this leap into the noosphere, which is the most important one for us in orienting ourselves. And this is Claire Deschardin formulated this as the law of complexity consciousness. Is the most basic tendency of the universe from the Big Bang is to cool, condense, become more complex. And with complexity of structure is an increase in consciousness, to the point where consciousness folds back on itself and becomes conscious of itself. And that's us. And that's how we're confusing. So that is the key one. Yeah.
I forget who the quote is, but suggesting that our consciousness is the star knowing itself.
Mm. That's my
Brian Swim.
thank you.
Yeah.
My brother Brian Swim. Yeah, and I'm delighted to have Brian's son Tom in our audience over here. You want to say something, Tom?
No.
You don't want to take over for Brian. Yeah, we the universe's way of knowing itself.
Wow. The noosphere as well, that's, for me, was where this all, like, you know, it just exploded in excitement, because that is where it kind of deals with the new physics of consciousness, that our thoughts might actually have matter, they might exist outside of us, and not just human thoughts, but all life might be contributing to this. Oops.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question about consciousness?
Sure,
at this
sure.
point?
Yeah.
So are you implying that consciousness is a function of the fire at the center of things, or of the cooling, or of the complexification?
You know, it's the way I see it is more mysterious than that. It's not like consciousness comes from matter and certain structures of matter. It's there all the time, and you know, we don't know what was there at the beginning. It's a profound mystery. It seems to be bound up in, you know, the God thought that is the fireball, that is the Big Bang, because it's emerging all the time, and we only know that through looking back. That's why, like Townsend puts it like this, he says, consciousness is a facet, like a diamond facet, a facet of matter. You don't have matter without consciousness, but it's a different kind. You know, the rock is not speaking to us in English. You know, it's manifesting in a rock way. You know, and a dog doesn't speak to us in French or Hebrew or whatever. Yeah.
You're saying that this falls in line with the Old New Testaments of the Bible. You could totally interpret it in that fashion if you wanted to have a Christian revelation, not to exclude anybody.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of these creation myths intuit this wisdom from within, and I think that's also testimony to the notion that, you know, consciousness is an inner version of external reality. And, you know, we've deformed our structures of consciousness through, I mean, particularly with the Industrial Revolution, the last 400 years. And we can go through that history, and it's fascinating and mind-blowing and horrifying. And I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, the witch burnings and the Holocaust and the plagues and the famines and just a horror show and endless bloodletting, out of which emerged, you know, modern consciousness, which has dominated the planet now. But, you know, we can go back further to indigenous societies where, you know, they intuited this through their relationship to the world around them. You know, they were highly conscious, they had our self-reflective consciousness. But their experience was an experience where everything spoke to them all the time. They were getting messages from place and from animals and from wind and from, you know, and that tradition is still, fragments of that are still alive in indigenous cultures, and we try to revive them as a path back to this sort of, sorry, I don't want to go on too long. Is that, yeah? Okay, let's move on. Jen, yeah? Sorry, just one point about the leap into the noosphere is that leaps in consciousness take place all the time, which should give us hope for what lies ahead, and that's in answer to your question. I think we're due for another leap. I think we're in the process of it. I think that's the singularity, and it's not a leap in more machinery, more clever machinery. It's a leap in our self-organization of our own consciousness. And to me, what I've been able to come up with, you know, and I'd love your help in clarifying this, is what I call the truth quest.
Call it what?
Truth quest. You know, this, yeah, so we'll get to that in a minute. We haven't really got to the heart of the talk yet, so I should probably move it along. But this is important because it sets the narrative out of which the truth quest emerges, because this is a relatively recent emergence, you know, modern self-reflective consciousness. Yeah?
Can you quantify memory as it relates to consciousness as far as personal story?
Quantify memory. You mean how far back can you remember?
No, I suppose the purpose of, as it relates to consciousness.
The purpose of memory.
Yeah. Your opinion.
But I think memory is an aspect of self-reflective consciousness. I think it's one of the dimensions. I think you have memory because there's no reflection without memory, right? Because that's what you reflect on. Reflection includes memory. Thinking includes memory. If you can't, hold the experience that you want to think about, if you can't remember it, then you can't think about it. So, if you don't have memory, consciousness, there's no consciousness, it doesn't function. So memory is intrinsic to self-reflective consciousness, as is imagination. Because imagination is not stuff that's already happened. It's the ground of consciousness just pumping stuff out, which, if you're an imaginative person, is constantly surprising you. If you pay attention to your imagination, all artists know this. They the good ones say, it wasn't my ego that manufactured this picture, it came to me. There's something in there. And it comes to you when you, sort of discipline the organ, you discipline the brain and the body, and that's your art. Then there's choice, there's action, which is an aspect of consciousness. Through imagining and remembering and reflecting, you say, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do that, I'm going to join the army. I'm going to defend the borders of my country, which is what I decided to do on the basis of my reflection and consciousness. And it could be a great decision and it could be catastrophic. And we see this taking place all around us. Does that answer your question? Maybe come back to it. Yeah. Okay, sure. Okay, so remember the scale, there's the Earth. We can fit about 1 million Earths into our sun. Everything that's meaningful has happened on that little baby Earth there. The Earth is about 1 billion of these every second. This is hydrogen bomb. 1 billion, sorry, the sun, excuse me. But we warmed by the sun. And we're basically steering our star as a thermonuclear explosion that is ongoing. There's burning about 4 million tons of hydrogen into helium every second. So we're actually steering into a nuclear furnace, and our galaxy has about 200 billion of these. And our galaxy is one galaxy of hundreds of billions of suns and about 1 trillion galaxies.
And it has a 93 million mile evacuation zone.
Exactly.
No closer, please.
Exactly. Yeah. So I just want to show a short video if I can. If you'll just bear with me a minute. So this is what we're actually looking at. It's not sitting still. This is the old model of the solar system. So then the planets rotating around the sun. But of course, we're spinning around our own axis at about 1,000 miles an hour. And the sun is spinning around the Milky Way galaxy at about 500,000 miles an hour. And it's spinning around the sun at about 67,000 miles an hour. So, we don't know this, but we are traveling somewhere. And extremely fast. We're on a journey already. These figures are off. But the image is great because it gives you a dynamic picture of what we're doing. So there's the sun blasting along, and planets are trailing after it in a way, held by gravity, the gravity of this massive sun.
Cosmic DNA.
Oh, DNA.
That looks like Nazi Herman's work.
DJ Sadu, yeah. So it's actually helical movement that we're tracing.
Looks darn spiralic to me.
Yeah. But the sun itself is moving between the galaxies. Yeah.
How long was that?
Maybe
But,
That's fair.
huh?
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
What I love about that video is I think that part of our job is to do better PR for the earth, for those that are thinking, you know, the Elon Musks and all that, not to rag on, should hope that's on video. We'll edit it out. Anyway, for those that wanna go to Mars and, you know, have all these escapist fantasies, I think our job is to teach them that this is actually the most exciting spaceship we could ever be on, and help them to fall in love with our planet and our calling and our challenge and all of that. So images like that, videos like that, any art we can create, how we write, the people that we talk to, we can help to shift that.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you. And the kicker is that, well, first of all, we couldn't possibly create a spaceship that is anywhere near as comfortable or beautiful or perfectly adapted to human existence. But the kicker is that the spaceship Earth actually created us. Yeah? So, you know, this idea that somehow a human creation could surpass what the Earth itself has done in making us appear. So this is the crucial sort of turning point, I think. These are portals into a new cosmology, basically. So you wanted to jump in there? Yep.
Oh, it just reminds me of, in Arizona, there was the Biosphere 2 project,
Oh, yeah.
which was an utter failure.
Right.
And it was actually funded by oil money.
Interesting.
And when they built it, a friend of mine who worked at Greenpeace came to the conclusion that, they're trying to see if the billionaires can survive while the rest of us don't. And the answer is you need an 8,000-mile wide biosphere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it comes out of the same fallacy that is driving the oil devastation, the oil economy. So this is what I want to look at now, the construction of the human by spaceship Earth. And with us, of course, the truth quest. So, you know, we need to think of the way we use our consciousness as something that is emerging from an evolutionary, you know, where, why, how. One of my early revelations was that this took place on the coast of South Africa. This is where, at least it was one of the places. That yellow line traces the voyage of the Hokulea, replica traditional Polynesian voyaging canoe, which the Hawaiians recently rebuilt and sailed around the planet using traditional navigation technology, just navigating by the stars. You folks, who's familiar with the Hokulea?
Yeah.
You know, the story in Malama Honua, they just did a round-the-world voyage in this canoe, landing in South Africa, recapitulating the human voyage out of Africa to Hawaii. South Africa is the site of the emergence of the oldest, it's home to the oldest indigenous culture on the planet, the San Bushmen. We found cultural artifacts going back 40,000 years. Their languages seem to be the oldest. The whole human genetic story develops from an ancestral population that the San were the closest to have the closest connection to. Yeah.
I read recently that they found pre-sapiens tools of human types in Morocco and I think Algeria from 1 million years ago. It's pretty recent stuff, but the point to that is that there are Homo species, pre-sapiens, that there's no evidence whether they died out, whether we've had a direct line of descent, whether we've had a species of sapien, of Homo interweaving over this period of time, over 100 years. But the fact of the matter is that regardless of that, animals have tools. A bird's nest is a tool.
Yeah,
the
sure.
technology, and chimpanzees get ants out.
Right.
So I think that the technology issue is a little bit of a red herring.
Yeah. I'm just referring to the evidence on genetic tracking done, the Genographic project, which tracked human populations around the planet and constructed a genetic tree going back to Khoisan Bushman populations in the Kalahari. So from a genetic point of view, every human being alive on the planet comes from that original population, which some Bushmen living today are the closest relatives. Also linguistically, their languages are the oldest. If you count phonemes, linguists date languages in terms of the complexity of sounds, phonetic complexity. Bushman languages have over 100. Junoisi has 126. English has about 44. Hawaiian has about 14. So it's seen as one of the ways. So there's a convergence of evidence suggesting that this was one of the hot spots for that leap into language, symbolization, and this explosion out of Africa that took place about 60,000 years ago, 50, 60.
That's what's so exciting for me when I learned about this was not, it's hard for me to remember exactly how old everything is, but I can remember that this was an explosion of consciousness. So there's, whether it's language or because they were eating seafood or the invention of fire and you know, grunting around a fireplace and then language started to form. I always thought of evolution as linear when I was first learning about it, and I was a kid, it was really boring because it was like, things just kept incrementally changing, and then I realized, no, it's like this. See, there's been these spikes, which that means it could happen again. Right. And that's what we need to happen again, really fast. So that's what gives me comfort. It helps me, as someone was saying, not be so angry, and fills me with excitement. So thinking about all of the, you know, this area, and we've traveled there and kind of seen all of this stuff. That's how it's come alive for me, and not just been about old artifacts and history. It's an indication of what could happen now and what is happening now.
We were there. So I don't know if you can see it. There's actually, this is a big ledge. It's a huge cave, about 30 foot long. It's one of the Paleolithic sites. There are about 3,000 of them on the coast of South Africa. The floor is just full with meters of fossilizing shell and bone. There's a view from inside it's a shelter. It's more like a penthouse. You know, it's a stunning view. You know, it's free. It's God-given. I would love to live in it. There you can see the human figure. You know, the size of the cave. It's massive. And they found human remains going back 126,000 years in these caves. There's almost continuous occupation on this coastline. Incredible profusion of animals, flora and fauna, hippos surfing. This is actually further up the coast. But when the Dutch settlers arrived in South Africa, they'd never seen these animals before. They called them seekoe, which means sea cow, because they found them grazing on seaweed in the estuaries of the rivers. Colony of penguins, Boulders Beach, Cape Town, African penguins. The ocean, the coastal ocean, is one of the richest fisheries on the planet. It's the most predator-dense ecosystem. It's kelp forest. The reconstruction of those first humans like us roamed the coast, occupied those shelters. The 3,000 caves are anticipated to be 10% of what is actually there, a lot of it covered by ocean. So there are probably about 30,000 sites on that coastline. This is the oldest symbolic expression that we have so far. 75,000-year-old piece of ochre found at Blombos Cave, which is just on that coastline. Some Bushmen, those who never left, they've been hunting and gathering in this environment. John Lou was talking about there last night. I don't know, anybody there with John Lou's talk? Oh, cool. There you go. Fantastic. Loved it. Intersects nicely with this. But he was talking about the extinction of the megafauna. As human beings moved through Africa, they killed all the big animals, the woolly mammoth and the rhino. Didn't happen in South Africa to the same degree. And the reason is, this is again more converging evidence for human origins there, that humans and animals co-evolved in South Africa. So animals developed, those animals that survived with Bushmen developed defenses against, as the hunters were learning how to hunt more efficiently, so the animals were learning how to evade the hunters more efficiently. So hunting is a high art among the Bushmen in South Africa. They developed very complex systems of tracking and animal communication using poison arrows. Magnificent. Excellent film, The Great Dance, if any of you want to see a record of the lost of the great hunters. So this is the leap, this is the dynamic as far as we know, that fire liberated the night from sleep, and allowed human beings to confront one another. So this is where you get the differentiation of me and the group, and the communication, sitting across the fire, and starting to communicate, development of language. So it seems that fire, language, individuation, the individual becoming an individual, and social complexity happening at the same time because you're sharing stories, building culture, and so on. So there's a dynamic between the individual becoming more individualistic, or actually individuated is the term Jung used rather than individualistic, which is our competitive capitalistic term, and group complexity. They're very different terms, and out of this emerges storytelling, discussion, painting. This is the basic structure of the truth quest. This is what we've lost. And I can go into great detail about how it's eliminated from the educational system and how we can bring it back in.
We don't have time.
We don't have time.
Not today.
So, maybe this is just a teaser. I've written about this. And of course, with this comes this explosion of imagination, fascination, choice and freedom, search for the good life. This is Jung, C.G. Jung's recognition of the mystery of consciousness. The psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders. The sine qua non of the world is an object. In other words, you can't have an object without a subject. It's the greatest degree odd that Westerners place so little regard to this fact, because we're obsessed with the external, because of our science obsession. Science is indispensable, but it only focuses on what you can measure in the outside world. So it ignores half of reality, and that's the half we live in, which is our subjectivity. Everything we do is motivated by our experience and our emotion. Swamped by the knowledge of external events, the subject of all knowledge is being temporarily eclipsed to the point of seeming non-existence. So objective reality is as much an event in consciousness as consciousness is an event in reality.
Could you go back a slide, please? I want to look at that second phrase it put up there so quickly.
Swamped by the knowledge of external events, the subject of all knowledge, us, our inner life, has been temporarily eclipsed, there should be a D there, sorry, to the point of seeming non-existence.
What does that mean?
It means because we're so obsessed with the external world, we're not paying attention to our subjectivity, to our inner experience.
So we have been seduced by the multiplications of phenomena that we have produced.
Exactly. By materialism. Yeah. We're bewitched by materialism, it's a good way of putting it.
And by our very separation.
And by the separation that implies, right?
Yeah.
So again, most indigenous epistemologies move back and forth between the inner and outer very comfortably. And that's what shamanism, the psychotechnologies of shamanism do. So, we can't have ayahuasca circles in the classroom, but we can use other technologies. And I think discussion, these primal mechanisms are very, very powerful and underused and not properly used. Soft technologies of consciousness. So we're always searching within the split between consciousness mediated by culture and reality. We know that what's in my head is not reality, but I can't know reality apart from knowing my head. And clearly my head is part of your reality, but what you know about it is not what I know about it. So there's no certainty, which means that in this knowledge quest and in our politics and our ethics and everything else, we need to be humble, and we need to accept the inevitability of uncertainty and that we're going to make mistakes. It's the human condition. So we are always between good and evil. And the idea of trying to be totally good, 100% good, you could argue is more dangerous than accepting that you're going to screw up a little bit and be good and evil. And that's the teaching of Reindeer, the medicine man, the Heyoka, the trickster. Medicine man needs to be God and the devil, both of them, in order not to be big evil. So there's small evil that you need to be friends with in order not to be big evil and think that you're God, as we see in our psychopathic political leaders. So we always explain another way of just representing that, in between. And this is because of memory, reflection, imagination. Between what creates us, which is the great spirit, the great mystery, and all the stuff we created. Right now, as you pointed out, we're mesmerized by what we create. So uncertainty, curiosity, humility, essential elements of the truth quest. There's a technical term for this that comes from a philosopher, Eric Voegelin, who I'm sure no one's heard of. Has anybody heard of Eric Voegelin?
What's his name?
Eric Voegelin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Voegelin, Voegelin. He's a German political philosopher, very obscure, as much a historian, wrote 36 volumes, 5 major later works on the history of world civilizations, like Toynbee. He's Toynbee plus philosophy. I wouldn't honestly recommend that you read him. If you want to know more about him, I'd read secondary works, because the level of erudition that you need to know what he's talking about. But if you're interested, if you're interested in theology, the Bible, Israel and Revelation's great. Because what he's doing is clarifying this in-between status and saying that when we lose this, when we think we've got certainty, we're on the road to hell and mass murder. And he's analyzing world civilizations in terms of this, and comes up, the term truth quest is actually the term that he used for this searching in between. And that's what I've sort of taken from him. So free choice means some choices are better, some not so good, some bloody awful. And none of us are going to be totally good and pure. If we think we are, then I get nervous. We live in between good and evil. So, and that realizing this helps us be big good and avoid big evil. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it wasn't the apple. Yeah.
Or the snake.
Or the snake. It was probably that rich seafood diet on the coast of South Africa. All those mussels and shellfish and lobsters that provided the fatty acids for the cerebral cortex to develop to the point of this leap and self-revelation. So this is the truth quest, a compass for the search. Top left-hand quadrant, you'll see this again and again. I'll go through them one at a time. The individual and community emerge together. The individual and community are mediated by face-to-face discussion. And none of this means anything without a big picture. Discussion goes on forever, gets nowhere, without continually trying to put the pieces together and create a big picture. And all 4 of these are the 4 elements of the truth quest, surrounded by the circle of wilderness, by the experience of reverence for the great mystery, out of which we come as the most beautiful thing we can experience. So that needs to be put in the curriculum. So when I teach a class, it's run like this. I'm reminding students all the time that this is just the finger pointing at the moon, or the finger pointing through the door at the beach outside, and that is really important in order to understand what's going on in the class and in your own head, to spend time immersed in nature. So the good of the whole is what drives this. This is representing it pictorially, individuation. I'll go through each one separately, big picture. This emerges as a whole, as a complex, and unfolds throughout the history of civilization. And these are in balance in primal societies for about most of the last 100,000 years. Individual and community, the community's been a group of people that you could recognize, maybe 50 people. You knew everybody personally. All your politics, your decision-making, your education took place face-to-face. Like this, everybody participated. It was based on caring and sharing. And everybody was adding to everybody else's big picture, which is what we do. If this was our community and we saw each other every day and lived together, we'd either tear apart or we'd build a community. This is the structure for community building, I would suggest, that is rooted in truth. Sorry, someone wanted to?
Do you want to just mention briefly why you chose the mandala as the
Thank you.
structure?
Yeah. You familiar with the mandala as the symbol for integrating opposites, showing that opposites need to, a whole is made up of tensional opposites. So it's the oldest symbol. The Stone Age petroglyphs of mandalas have got like 30,000 years. It's the most universal. You find it in all cultures. Object of meditation in Tibetan Maoism and Buddhism and Kabbalah and Christianity and Native American, the medicine wheel, Native Americans has been a big inspiration for me. Sorry? Celtic, of course. This is just something I give to my students for moving between those four. Question yourself, question others, question the status quo, keep questioning, reflect, and this is the process of looking back on your experience. It's invisible, you get no grades for this, it's almost impossible to check, but it's clear when you've got a class of students who you get to know personally. I never have a class bigger than this room, more than 20 people. And over a semester we get to know each other and we try and form a community. And so it's clear to me who's thinking and who isn't. You know, if you're thinking, you're developing and things are shifting and becoming integrated and you're becoming empowered. And imagine, to encourage, give imaginative exercises. A lot of movies, a lot of film, stimulate imagination. First person, students write their stories, share their stories, expand experience. What you do outside the classroom is most important. Try and get, for me, leaving South Africa was huge. Leaving apartheid South Africa. I went to a high school in England where people didn't know what a Jew was. They didn't know what a Jew was, only Jew in school. So from an anti-Semitic racist community to good old liberal England under a Labour government. Got a great science education. Went to one of the best science high schools in the county. And then university, I got an outstanding science education at Cambridge University in England, history and philosophy of science. Completely different, no one had a clue what was going on in South Africa. Another universe. So for me, expanding, having that experience of two cultures was mind-blowing. And, posed the problem of epistemology, of truth quest. These people think they've got the answer, these people think they've got the answer, they completely disagree. Where am I? What is the answer? How do I know? It's not just another. So the more you expand experience, clearly you get a handle on things. And then you've got to express what you know. You've got to keep expressing. You can't just sort it out in your own brain. You've got to write it down, you've got to talk it, you've got to act it out, you've got to sing it, you've got to... discussion is what speeds it up. So far it's been absolutely great. This is the most talkative audience I've ever had, and we haven't even started. Question and answer, and it just makes it so much easier for me to talk sense, I hope, and communicate.
You probably should have mentioned that I was a student and got to experience this method, and we would often, about this size, sit in a circle and go through this method, and so I was able to see, it wasn't just the teacher teaching it and then you take your notes and you sort of take it at face value. I got to watch the group change together, and it was very emotional, very moving. So that really stuck with me, and I was able to take it with me and use it in my work as well.
So it doesn't happen, thanks so much for that, because it doesn't happen without trust. You've got to feel safe in order to share anything that's important. And establishing that in a university, which is essentially a competitive environment where teachers will often grade the curve. I don't grade the curve, I have no exams, and I've been very fortunate to have complete creative freedom in how I teach. No one checks on my classes, other than my student evaluations, which...
It was writing intensive though, we didn't
It's all writing
work.
intensive. And speaking intensive, and thinking intensive, and reading intensive. So, students get the grade they feel they deserve, and they invariably feel they didn't quite deserve the generous grade that they got.
I get the cosmology, and I'm very grateful for it. I love it. And as a student of Brian Swim and Thomas Berry, but isn't there a disjunct between that and transferring that into politics? Because in politics, you must be decisive, you must be really clear. I ran for a local office some years ago, and I ran, in essence, on a truth quest.
Nice.
And
fantastic.
I was sort of laughed out of town. It was fun, but there wasn't getting anything done.
Right.
Have to be decisive, have to be clear, have to be sure
Right.
that you're right and so forth.
No, absolutely.
All the things that work against this mystery of
Exactly. Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, you're swimming against the tide, you know, you're ahead of your time, you're ahead of the culture. But if you're in a culture where, you know, the basic values are not, you know, how to get a job which will get you as much money as possible, and how to be smarter and better than everybody else, but how to be as generous as possible, to have as many relationships that are based on caring and sharing as possible, what you would be doing, truth questing, is the default. That's the point. The point is culture change. With no institutional change or policy change is really going to fly without the consciousness and culture of the people who are implementing that policy or running those institutions. I mean, we see now in American politics, to make it political, for a while since you brought up a political question, institutions that were established by the founding fathers to prevent us slipping into tyranny and fascism. You know, it seems clear to me as a political philosopher and many others that, you know, America is sliding towards fascism, and that the people are using people in power who run the institutions that are designed to check and balance one another, are undermining those institutions for the sake of certainty. The conviction that there's one person or one party that has the one truth, and that everything else is deathly dangerous and needs to be exterminated, if necessary, by force of arms. And we see this movement taking place globally now, and it's very frightening. And the idea that somehow or other, you know, just strengthening our institutions is going to do this, or referring back to the Constitution, ignores the fact that the Constitution was drawn up by men, all, you know, white men as we know, some who were very profoundly moved by Native American politics, but, you know, sort of failed to implement some of the deeper principles, number one of which was the spiritual law. And are quite incapable of dealing with the situation. They come out of a different world, and ignored the fact that democracy cannot work in a culture of ignorance, and a culture of greed, and a culture of competitiveness. So, you know, until we deal with that head on and call it for what it is, and essentially walk away from the emperor. You know, this stuff is taught in schools from kindergarten onward. It's embodied in the institutions. So the first step to me is this step of consciousness and culture. Name things, clarify things, put out memes that expose the emptiness, the flimsiness of these institutions, and give examples of cultures that behaved in an opposite way, because everybody agreed that what counted was generosity and honesty and love of earth and love of one another and caring and sharing and consciousness. We don't live in that culture. So someone had a, yeah,
Well,
sure.
you know, they're showing a film right now about removing the lower four dams in the Snake River.
Are we out of time?
No,
No, go ahead.
Here's an example where
Yeah.
we've gone to Olympia, we've talked to Derek Kilmer, we've shown them all the scientific evidence that they don't need those dams.
Right, yeah.
That they're gonna kill the fish.
Right,
and there's something that we're good. Kilmer just approved a $31 million bill to help support the people that wanna keep the dams. So any further political action on our part, and we've done all the moral, scientific, physical, whatever, we've given them all the information anyone could want. But the decision was based on, you can imagine.
money.
Yeah, well, the decision is coming out of the consciousness of the decision makers. Very clearly. So, you know, what I'm saying is that what's driving these sorts of decisions is a consciousness that is antithetical to real happiness of the decision makers. You know, there's a delusion. We live in a world, unfortunately, where there's a great deformation, there's a great pathology of consciousness. And I think it's self-evident in how our actions are manifesting. And I think we need to deal with that directly. That because we are a materialistic culture, we are confused about consciousness and culture. And we want material fixes and technological fixes. Elon Musk, you know, let's just build a machine and fly to Mars and it'll be better than the Earth. we'll start afresh there. You know, it's a form of psychopathology. It's a profound illness of the psyche, and you can only diagnose it. Well, not only, but you do diagnose it through the story as you diagnose an illness. You can see where the infection took place. And you can see health. We have models of health.
Is that deformation a newish thing, or does it go back, say, 60,000 years or 40,000 years?
Good question. Okay, so two answers, yes and no. It's because good and evil is there with self-reflective consciousness. Good and evil comes with freedom. So the possibility of screwing up. What's interesting is that the defenses against big evil in primal societies for about 50,000 years seemed remarkably effective. I can get into that. And then there's a take-off point with agriculture, the last 10,000 years.
Are we in a cycle of creation and destruction in the sort of Hindu thinking, and we're at this sort of point where we're heading into destruction, but it will almost inevitably cycle around and we will be in creation again?
I don't, you see, I think the great novelty of consciousness is that nothing's inevitable, because it's all taken place in the realm of human creativity and consciousness. And that is the big novelty of the noosphere. That is the take-off point.
We will choose.
We will choose.
What's
That wouldn't be what a Hindu would probably say.
Right, right. There's also, I wanted to toss in a book called Dark Night, Early Dawn, that helps me with the situation with the Snake River. Is in this time of this kind of singularity, we are going to see opposite things happening at the same time. So we are going to, we'll see people, because it's, the dominant thinking is in its death throes. So some people are going to irrationally hold on to capitalism because for them it's survival. They're willing to die for this, because if they are wrong, it's unthinkable. And then, but at the same time, we'll see, I don't want to call it like our side, because I don't want to, put it like that, but we're going to see victories, and we're going to see life continuing to evolve, and we don't know how it's all gonna, and to me it's a non-linear thing, so that's the mystery and that's the excitement, more exciting than any action superhero movie you've ever seen.
Can I just reinforce George's point, and then I'll come to you. Tannard's observation about this discovery, the discovery of evolution, is that the evolutionary story, this picture that I've painted, which is an introduction to the big story, the big cosmology, is the most significant advance in hominid cognition in 2.5 million years. So it's not a circle. This is the great discovery. I mean, you can tear your hair out and grieve over the horrors of 400 years of industrial capitalism or Western civilization, but the great gift has been science. It's part of the differentiation of consciousness. It is a gift. A huge price was paid. And now we're in a position, we have the privilege of taking the gifts and correcting the pathology, using the gifts to heal the pathology.
I was just going to say, well, first of all, what is the biggest threat to this expanding consciousness, or expanding level of consciousness, in just your opinion? And do you view, overall the trend of consciousness and our awareness has been going up, do you view it as having enough momentum that it's inevitably going to continue going up?
I honestly feel, good question. I fluctuate.
That's why I'm asking.
There are times where I feel,
biological death can be real. We run out of oxygen, then it's over.
We've come close before.
Yeah,
we've bounced back.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just a devil's advocate, That's not
The other thing I take comfort in, if we think about the noosphere, is if humans go extinct, even though that's tragic, and all the other species, the sixth mass extinction, we were still here. It happened, and so maybe those remnants will still be in the noosphere, and then something that comes next, life will continue, the universe will continue, and we were here, and it happened, and so that kind of soothes that. What keeps you up at night kind of stuff. And then other times I get on the positive, so it depends on the day. Depends on how many animals you have to think about losing forever, or the walrus scene in
in a way, I don't like that question, great, because it lets us off the hook.
Yeah.
You know, it says if it is inevitable, okay, you know, I can kick back and, you know, I don't have to get so involved. And I think, you know, if it is inevitable that there will be an advance in consciousness, we can just relax and everything, it's fine. I somehow, I don't know, maybe it's just my, you know, Jewish angst and, you know, sense of, you know, the messianic element in Jewish and Kabbalistic thinking. But I think we've reached the point where it really does depend on us. And it wouldn't depend on us if it was going to happen automatically. That misses the point.
Yeah.
The point is that we need to get to that point in our own development, our own consciousness, where we feel our actions can tilt the balance, our personal actions. And that's one of the points that this book Georgia recommended makes. Chris Beige, who works actually with your dad, with Brian, I don't know, still is, at the California Institute of Integral Studies.
And that's that again?
It's Dark Night, Early Dawn, towards an ecology of consciousness.
And that part, when I get to the feelings of despair which come up, when I reflect again on evolution brought us to this ability to choose our own evolution. That's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane to me. So then it's like, wow, I cannot give up, because if I do, then I'm making a different choice. So.
I believe the biggest threat, I'll stop if you want.
No, please, I'm just trying to give everybody a chance. Go ahead. Ron.
I believe the biggest threat is the confusion of individual consciousness and collective consciousness. It's not a process of building, of doing this individual thing. I mean, obviously we have to do that. But I believe what you talked about Jung being, describing the ignorance of the psyche.
Yeah.
To me, there's an ignorance of the collective consciousness possibility as well. And that's what we're missing in our society and in our globe. There is not the same effort going into, give you an example. I bet if we did a poll of everyone in this conference, we might not find anyone who voted for Donald Trump. They are here.
Yeah.
We can't do it without them.
Right. And, okay, so the action point, the takeaway?
The action point is there has to be a strategic way of involving everyone.
Oh, engaging the community.
In a particular kind of conversation, not dialogue, not deliberation, not problem solving, not creative problem solving, but a particular kind where we're all seeking together, facing the problems realistically, feeling it in our heart, doing the same kind of thinking that some of us are doing here, but it has to be done at the whole system, collective level.
And where do we get there? How do we get there?
I have a strategy.
I'll
give you a handout. I have a handout.
Sorry, actually.
One's real quickie, which was, and then another one. The Aborigines in Australia are not as old as the sun.
They got from South Africa to Australia very quickly, but their DNA goes back to that ancestral African population.
And the question, you started
So
talking
they're
about.
about 50,000 years, sorry?
So, and you started to talk about agriculture, and then you got interrupted. I'd love if you continued to talk a bit about agriculture, the beginning of it.
It seems as all the evidence suggests that the move to agriculture was not a happy one. It was not, oh wow, let's do this. It was because we ran out of big game and we ran out of space. The human population was so successful, a hunting population, they're such good hunters. They spread very rapidly throughout Africa and then Asia and the Middle East. And then it was probably through the gathering wisdom of the woman who figured out the cycles of planting, of seed planting and fertilization and cultivation. And once you have agriculture, you've got land that you have to defend. And you've got resources that are valuable to a starving population of nomads. And so we have, for example, around between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, we have these great hordes of mobile nomadic kurgans, is what Ryan Eisler calls them. Are you familiar with Ryan Eisler's work? The great waves of these nomads from the steppes, mounted on horseback, sweeping through Europe wiping out and integrating with these old European early agricultural settlements, which were more or less peaceful and more or less egalitarian partnership societies. Evidence suggests, I mean, a lot of this is speculation. And then once we get that, we're involved in an endless cycle of warfare, slavery, walled cities, hierarchy, specialization, domination become the mark. These are the hallmarks of civilization. And this is the, Terence McKenna calls this the scorching of the ego of Homo sapiens. It's a trauma, it's a species trauma. And what that does is to question your faith in the universe. The universe is not a happy place, you can't trust the universe. Fear enters in as the dominant emotion, anger, anxiety, and these start deforming consciousness as opposed to, you know, the original situation was much more Garden of Eden situation, which fits in with your point about, you know, these, the biblical narrative of creation. There's an intuition that there was a golden age earlier on. And periodically human beings would revert back to that and experience that as hunters. And we see that in North America, you know, to a magnificent extent with the First Nations of North America. And the degree to which their lives were infused with beauty and, you know, more or less, you know, plenty. I mean, there are times of famine and starvation. You had your hand up a long time ago,
Yeah, going back to answer your question, I'm looking at that for my thesis, essentially. I'm taking a Master's in Environment Management through Royal Oaks University, and my thesis is not narrowed down, but I'm looking at the global environmental movement and the momentum behind that, and taking complexity theory and nonlinear dynamics, and essentially meaning, how do we get to that leap? How does life create? How do we move to that leap? And there's conditions that are required to get to that leap. Conditions of self-organization, conditions of a critical mass, conditions of emergence, and in that emergence are other conditions that are required. And what's a catalyst? Right, the catalyst, of course, is a huge part of that. And the reason I'm writing this paper is because I believe it's already true that the environmental movement is at that critical tipping point. That we are there and ready to form the next newer, higher order, which we don't even know when that amalgamation happens, and it becomes, we can't even understand what that will become because it's unpredictable, because the rules that are applied to that as the organization morphs into something, it's unknowable. So if you look at the example of the eye, how the eye formed, it was unknowable that the eye would become, or the hearing, or even life would begin in the first place. So yeah, I'm looking at those conditions and what's present. And a big one on that is networking. So to bring it back to this conference here, looking at the Weaver network and what they're just in the infancy of looking at, and I've talked to them, that is a huge component of that. And it becomes scary for an organization or a person to become part of this larger whole, because you feel like you're losing the self-identity in that, but that's not the case. The cell in your body is still part of the whole of your body, and you still have consciousness to move your body, but the cell acts independently of itself as well. So it's an awesome question. I believe we're at that point. I honestly believe, like we were chatting earlier, I have such deep faith now, and I've gone through a really big depression on where we were at, but I have such deep faith that humanity is here for another 1,000 years, that we are at that point that it will meld and create something beautiful and new that we can't even understand what it is.
I think the presumption.
I'm with you.
The presumption to know ahead of time how that's going to look is the problem.
Right.
We're here to learn how to plug in.
Yeah, you know, I think I totally, you know, love and agree with your vision. I do. I think that's a real possibility that we're on the edge of this and that it's happening. But I think we have to approach it with the sense that it is up to us.
Yes.
And that we can't, that
I don't think it's inevitable.
Yeah.
But I think it takes action from the people. The network that is happening right now, what I'm saying is the people that are here in this conference, that is the action that is already happening.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
We need just to get to that little more tipping point to tip that over.
Right. You know, I'm still running out of time, folks. I haven't got to the heart of my talk, actually, which was...
Tomorrow.
Fly through it.
There's always tomorrow.
Which was, in the second brother.
Maybe just pull the truth quest up one more time. I wanted to quickly say that I work with a lot of Trump voters. So I'm immersed in, opposition find I find the model,
Which one do you want?
oh, no, just the,
The four quadrants.
the four quadrants,
Yeah, but I'm gonna find it.
Oh.
It's back.
The model and the practices, I find them very useful in my work and having conversations that I feel are making a difference. So I do believe in the importance of, we have to take this out of just, like-minded, we need this to recharge our batteries, but we also have to take it out and have this conversation with those that differ, and not, conversation, we have to interact, we need each other. So, I just wanted to recognize your point is very valid.
I'm sorry, I was only picking up from the brother and then.
Just with on the discussion of this, when do we get to this lead of consciousness or in the policy work to get us to a new direction? Like while we're kind of debating and discussing that, by having some of that privilege to do that, like these events will continue to happen and those frontline communities are actually have to live with this consequences. As we are discussing this on the very, how do we move together? And the biggest problem with it is capitalism. It's this extractive idea of we can continue to just take materials out. And while these events happen, those are the key points to transition into regenerative systems and move away from the capitalistic systems that created them. Because as these areas continue to get hit, there's no point in restructuring them in the same system that's going to be destroyed.
Absolutely. No, I mean, clearly, this is, you're asking about agriculture, and the big takeoff was really was these three revolutions of the 16th century, which kicked this whole thing into high gear: population, energy, information, mobility, and this is the beginning of capitalism. It's actually it's a combination of three 16th century revolutions: scientific revolution, commercial revolution, capitalist revolution, and Protestant Reformation. They reinforced one another. It was a negative synergy, which effectively killed the truth quest in principle. So, simply telling that story in a way that makes sense completely undermines the authority of the consciousness that supports everything. So I think, in answer to your point about emergent consciousness and emergent phenomena tipping the balance, I think the story itself is immensely important. One of the things Brian Swim says is, how do we get out of this crisis? And he suggests we tell a better story, because the story frames consciousness. It's a fundamental element of human cognition. We've lost the story. You don't get it in academia. You don't get it in high school, how everything connects. You've got a very simple story. It's a story of everything was barbaric until the Industrial Revolution. We got capitalism, and now everything's just going to continue to get better, and we're going to get more fantastic machinery, and we're going to fly to Mars, and we'll have this machine and that machine, and these incredible phones, which are absolutely incredible. Nevertheless, it's a tool. It misses the point. It completely misses the point. So, what we have over here is Locke, Hobbes, a whole philosophy which is based on. Okay, sure, yeah. So this is the anti-truth quest that emerges, and that supports capitalism, industrial capitalism, that supports all our institutions. This is the sort of the lifeblood of the consciousness of the culture, and it's undermining. It's being undermined. It's collapsing. It's no longer persuasive. You've got the last gasp of the dinosaurs in power right now. And the question is, how much damage is going to be done? Will we lose the orcas or not? That is the question. Will we, lose the salmon? Will we blow up the dams? These are how much before this thing changes? And what will be left? Will it be 1,000 years of a hellscape, which is what David Wallace Wells says we're on course for, with a 4-degree increase in temperature, right on course for the hellscape. Right now, it's almost guaranteed we're going to have 2 degrees warming, and that is what the United Nations calls catastrophic. So this is all hands on deck. It's time to panic, but not completely. And the way out is through reorganizing this, and then what happens is it becomes viral. It is actually a meme. I believe that this model is very simple, and that this is actually spreading everywhere, and that clarifying it theoretically, as I've been trying to do, is a way of accelerating it exponentially.
Can I just ask you to reframe one of your words? It's not time to panic, it's time to feel the threat.
Okay.
There's a big difference in that.
Time to
Panicking is your house on fire and you don't know what to do,
Sure.
you're running down the street.
I'm totally with you. It's actually the title of Wallace Wells's article. It is time to panic. But he's saying what he means by that is the same sort of urgency that we had World War II, except exponential.
Except that's part of the problem is going back to a militaristic model.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
World War II
Yeah.
gave us
He
the
doesn't say
nuclear
that.
waste
He
pod.
doesn't say that.
Yeah.
He does, in the book, he doesn't say that.
Yeah.
And the book is really good. It's
Yeah.
much better than the article,
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah.
got flack for good reason.
Yeah.
But the whole book is really worth reading, and he doesn't use that militaristic model.
Thank you.
No, I
The person
agree,
who uses
yeah,
that militaristic model is Paul Gilby.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's.
Who knows better?
Don't bother. Yes, the book is great.
And you know, Charles makes that point very well in his new book on Climate and a New Story, and that's essentially my point. You know, clearly this is a model that's based in connection and love and understanding and communication. And but all I'm saying is that if we could generate that collective consciousness over a threat and a possibility, we can do it exponentially over this, because the rewards are immediate, and they, you know, the ultimate rewards of a gorgeous earth and a loving, caring human community.
You said that you don't feel you've gotten to the heart of what you wanted to. Is there one thing you can point us to that would take us to the heart of it?
Actually, I think you did cover
Okay.
a lot of it, because a lot of it was covered just without the slides. And I think maybe just the expanding on each quadrant is the part we didn't.
Your idea of Truth Quest is new to me, so is there a resource you might recommend? Or not? Just, are there so
sure,
many,
no.
you can't recommend one?
I wrote a book about it.
You
Here.
did, okay, very good.
Yeah, that's really.
Louis?
Yeah.
Where's the book about?
Okay, thank you.
Future Primal.
We've
Okay.
just started a website and a Facebook page, and so there's, the Facebook is at Cosmology. We have some cards too,
Oh,
that
yeah.
got that information.
Yeah, why don't you just get in touch, you know, folks, because we've got a lot of material. I'm in the process of writing another book on the Truth Quest.
And we don't have
So-
anywhere to be, so those that wanna stay on and talk story, you can.
You're selling
But
them here?
I've got a couple of copies.
I would like one.
You want one?
I don't think you've got enough for everybody, but we can try to.
Also, you're going to be on the culture repair panel tomorrow from 2 till 3:30 in the
Oh, okay.
USO hall.
Oh.
It was in a conflict in the schedule in the same time slot today, so it couldn't be in two places at once.
Oh, great.
So tomorrow from 2 to 3:30, a panel with Charles Eisenstein in the USO hall.
Fantastic, thanks so much.
I think it's worth remembering that Fred Pollock, who founded Future Studies, said societies die when they don't have a positive vision of the future. And as far as his defense economy, the military economy, which essentially it is, then that's no future. But he studied 500 periods of change in human history, and he said they're always presaged by small groups of people coming together, collectively having a positive vision of the future.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's
So-
what we're hoping.
Well, and that's what we're.
That's what we're doing.
That's, yeah.
I
From the
just,
book, The Future of the Future.
Time to do this.